adapt the theme of a particular class to the visitor. These visitors will not come and take over a class. They're not going to be here to lecture to us. They will make brief provocative statements, and we then, the two of us and all of you, will interrogate them from the standpoint of the agenda that we will be trying to advance in the course and that we will begin to lay out today. Now, because of that, we want to take advantage of these first three classes in which we will not have visitors to lay out as much of a basis, a conception of the agenda as possible. And consequently, the two of us will talk more for more of the time than we will normally talk in the rest of the course. Not to say that there won't be discussion in these first three classes, but there will be more intervention by us than there is likely to be afterward. Your engagement is crucial. So the whole point here is discussion between us and with you. The normal practice will be that one of us will begin a class, the other will respond. There'll be some conversation between us and then conversation with you. And the presence of a visitor will naturally modify and complicate that arrangement. Now, we're not going to announce to you beforehand who these visitors are. Some of them are well known and others are unknown. Some are controversial and others aren't. And we don't want it to be the case that anyone from outside the course, for example, attends a particular class in order to see or hear a particular visitor. We don't want it to degenerate into a spectacle or a tournament. And we therefore think it's more prudent not to announce beforehand who these visitors are for the reason that I've just stated. Then in today's class, we're going to begin to propose this agenda and to discuss it with you. And there is already the following modification in the syllabus, that in the next class, we will discuss the themes that are laid out in the syllabus for February 14th and February 21st. And some of the discussion originally intended for February 21st will already come into next week's class. The reason again is that on February 21st, we will have our first visitor. Cornell.
Should I stand or sit, you think? Are you going to stand or sit? What are you going to do?
I will improvise following your doctrine.
Oh, okay. He's a jazz man too, you see. No, I'm going to stand because when I start talking about American democracy, sometimes spirit hits me and I'm full of fire. So I'll just be moving in a whole lot of different ways. But I want to first say that it's just a blessing to once again teach a class with my dear brother Roberto Unger. It was 45 years ago where I sat where you now sit. He was in his mid-20s and already had begun to set the world on fire coming from Brazil. It was tremendous creativity, courage, but most importantly, an openness to a variety of different traditions. He comes from the highbrow humanist tradition, the legacy of Athens, deeply shaped by Socratic sensibilities, raising the most fundamental questions concerned with paideia, that formation of attention, that cultivation of a critical self, and that maturation of a loving and courageous soul. He also comes out of the legacy of Jerusalem with deep sense of remembrance, but always tied to prophecy, always tied to the future. He's also deeply romantic, and we're going to push him on that. And by romantic, we don't mean excessively optimistic, but we mean concerned with imagination and reconfiguring and recreating ourselves and the world with a kind of endless, restless, visionary orientation. And that means, of course, he cuts against the grain, especially of the neoliberal university, which is much more specialization, professionalization, commodification, rationalization, and cash waiting for you. That's not Roberto Unger. And when I heard him lecture, 1975, just 44 years ago, it touched not just my mind, but it touched my heart and my soul. It resonated with the best of what the possibilities of American democracy were all about, even as a so-called outsider, a fellow American in the hemispheric sense, from Brazil. 1975 was a very, very different moment. We were talking about the crisis of democracy then. Samuel Huntington had just published a book called The Crisis of Democracy. Don't allow the demos to engage in too much high level of participation. They're going to want to shape the opinions of the elites, and the elites of the experts. They're the ones who know. And here we are in 2018, and I think we can all agree we are in profound crisis. And we'll be looking at the scope of it, the depth of it, the breadth of it. And so to be able to be in dialogue with Roberto Unger after 20, we've taught this class now, what, 20-some times since 1995, maybe? Our book came out in 98. That's 21 years. It's hard to believe. Is always a blessing. It's always a way for me to be renewed, because you shall see I'm much closer to the legacy of Melville and Faulkner and Toni Morrison and Curtis Mayfield and Donny Hathaway, which is always obsessed, maybe too much, with the underside of American democracy, you see. And it's partly because of my understanding of who we are as a species. Do we really have the capacity, the courage? Do we have what it takes to sustain the Pascalian wager in ordinary people that says that they can govern themselves? That says that they can raise their voices, not their echoes, their voices at the highest levels of decision-making processes of institutions that guide and regulate their lives. That is a profoundly unpopular notion in the history of the culture of our species. And it's one of the reasons why democracies are so rare in the human adventure. And they're very fragile and precious, and they tend not to last too long. And as we shall see, every democratic experiment, especially the U.S. democratic experiment, usually has imperial background conditions. An imperial democracy from the vantage point of our precious indigenous brothers and sisters. A white supremacist democracy from the vantage point of my great-grandmama and my great-grandfather. Not just Jim Crow, but they also had moments of enslavement in the name of U.S. laws and government. Been a patriarchal democracy in the name of the vast majority of Americans, always women, 52% of almost every generation. So this is not any identity politics concern with minority concerns. No, not at all. Not at all. So let's begin by turning to the first page of the foundational text of the Western philosophical tradition, Plato's Republic. Carabin, yesterday I went down to Piraeus. The grand philosophical achievement of the Greeks, Plato's Republic, an indictment of the grand political achievement of the Greeks, democracy. That his master, his mentor, Socrates, put to death by the democracy, and that going down is like going down into Hades, echoing of Homer's Odyssey. He's going down into the darkness. He's going down into the mess. He's going down into where the demos are. Piraeus, of course, was the stronghold of democracy. It was the source of commerce. It was where all the so-called foreigners, the Thracians and others, interacted with the Athenians, which is to say, in the language of most of the Greeks, the barbarians interacted with the civilized ones. Plato's indictment of democracy will reverberate throughout this class. And Plato's indictment was what? That he said, show me a democracy where you allow the demos to rule. In fact, his definition of democracy is a polis full of freedom and parrhesia. And parrhesia is pulled from line 24a of Plato's Apology, where Socrates says, parrhesia was the cause of my unpopularity. Parrhesia is what? Fearless speech, frank speech, plain speech, unintimidated speech. People willing to raise their voices and not have to wear the mask or play a role in order to fit into some status quo, to speak from the depths of who they are. And Plato says, oh, democracy is a polis of freedom and parrhesia. And he says, and every democracy is shot through with unruly passions of the demos in overwhelming, pervasive ignorance. And it will generate anarchy and instability. It will generate strife and rebellion, and it will lead always to a tyrant. Turn to page, that chapter, that book 8 in Plato's Republic. Every democracy, he says, will generate a strong, usually a man, given the patriarchal and phallocentric orientation of the backdrop of most democracies, tilted toward the men, you see. And this is something, of course, that we see even in the founding text of this republic. James Madison, Princeton, not Harvard. Blame it on New Jersey. No, I'm just kidding. James Madison says what? One of the most famous lines in the Federalist Papers. Founding texts of the American democratic experiment, but cast, of course, as civic republicanist project. He says, if every Athenian citizen was Socrates, that every Athenian assembly would still be a mob. Profoundly anti-democratic in its belief in the capacity of ordinary people to govern themselves. This is for elites. This is for the property. This is for the white brothers with property. White brothers with no property don't participate. Women don't participate. Slaves don't participate. It's been hard for the Catholics to get in, given the Protestant tilt of it. Jewish brothers and sisters hardly get in. Very difficult to get in because of the Protestant tilt of it, you see. Yet something very precious is going on, you see. The beginnings of the possibility of the democratic ideal that can be expanded and deepened and refined, but based primarily on the blood, sweat, and tears of social movements, of progressive organizations, of prophetic synagogues and mosques and churches and civic orientations to broaden not just the enfranchisement, but most importantly, this is where Plato was so very important, and one of the reasons why we're spending so much time in Alexis de Tocqueville, still probably the best text written on the American empire, the American experiment, by that French aristocrat in the 1830s, that we're talking about democracy not just as a set of procedures, not just as a set of rules, not even just as a mode of governance, but also as a way of life. This is where Emerson, this is where Whitman, this is where John Dewey, this is where Murray O'Rourke-Kaiser, this is where Ella Baker, this is where Fannie Lou Hamer, this is where Martin Luther King Jr. come in. Because democracy as a project has everything to do with, yes, the dignity of ordinary people participating in such a way that they're shaping their collective destiny, but it also has to do with a tone and a temper and a temperament. And that's not reducible to some technical orientation. I'm so glad to have our two brothers, or you all are from the Kennedy School, is that right? Anytime, yeah, exactly. Anytime I say Kennedy School, I'll get ready with John Dewey in my pocket. Oh, there's those managerial brothers and sisters. There's no technocrats, brother. No, I shouldn't do that. That is homogenizing, essentializing. I'm wrong to do that, but I tend to too often do it anyway, because the Kennedy School has a variety of magnificent voices and so forth and so on. But the dominant tilt is the dominant tilt of the larger society, and recruiting the various elites for the larger society. That's all, you see. And that's why so much of when we talk about democracy as a way of life, it includes ourselves. We begin with ourselves, our placement in a ruling class institution, producing managerial and professional types tied to capitalist elites, oftentimes almost parasitic on, if not the financial elites and the oligarchs of our day, even those who move into NGOs but still want to run things. I'm for the social justice movement, but I'm from Harvard. You know, I'm in here to run it. So much for Veritas. Truth, the condition of truth is to allow suffering to speak, every voice heard. The anthem of black people, lift every voice. Not just the Harvard voices, not just the elite voices, not just the expert voices, but all of those voices have to undergo some formation of attention, some cultivation of critical orientation, some maturation of a courageous soul. Every human being has access to that, including precious Harvard students. But no slice of the demos has a monopoly on it. Plato's argument was, you're wrong, Brother West. It's a pipe dream, Brother West. And that's a serious challenge. All you have to do is read the greatest play ever written, The Indictment of American Democracy by Eugene O'Neill, called The Iceman Cometh. What is The Iceman Cometh about? It's about the lack of the capacity of ordinary people to ever cultivate the critical consciousness and the courage to save their democracy. They'd rather defer to the strong man. That's the Dostoevskian challenge. Human beings are really too weak to really bear the burden of deciding for themselves. They want authority. They want magic. They want charisma. They want people to decide for them and follow the piper. That's not a marginal view. That's a serious challenge to democracy. And we've got to wrestle with this. That's why this class is not solely about democratic statecraft, but it's about democratic soulcraft as well. And soulcraft has to do with how do you cultivate civic virtues, democratic virtues? How do you cultivate democratic tones and modes of being in the world and ways of interacting with one another and trying to agree to disagree and having passionate engagement with folk you think are completely wrong and still being able to keep track of their humanity. That's the tone, that's existential. It's usually not highlighted in the textbooks about democracy. And yet when you lose that intangible stuff in democratic experiments, you end up with the central figure in Plato's Republic, Thrasymachus. Might makes right. Power dictates morality. Or as the great Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel used to put it, you end up viewing life as a gold rush, end up worshiping the golden calf, and the golden rule becomes he or she who has the gold will rule. Power, power, power. The Frankenstein that the great Mary Shelley saw in her novel. That modern Prometheus that's not tied to creativity, breakthrough, but tied to gloom, and surveillance, domination, exploitation, subordination. And all of us then ending up being trapped. So yes, we're going to talk about nuclear catastrophes, ways that the whole planet trapped, having something to do with human greed, disproportionately corporate greed. We're going to talk about nuclear catastrophes. We hope we can finish this semester without a nuclear catastrophe. You never know. It just takes a button. Just takes a button. We forget about that. We're going to talk about economic catastrophe, grotesque wealth inequality, decrepit schools, indecent housing, stagnating wages. What is it? 1 out of 3 Americans go to college. 2/3 of our fellow citizens don't go at all. How will they subsist in the new knowledge economy? You see. 22 of the children living in poverty. 1 out of 2 black and brown children under 6 living in poverty. That's 50% of black children, black and brown, in the richest nation in the history of the world. What does that bid for the future of democracy? Poverty educates in a variety of different ways. Not uplifting. You see. We're going to talk about moral catastrophe in terms of materialism, hedonism, narcissism. That's what Martin King had in mind when he said the test of any democratic project, especially American democracy, is materialism, racism, poverty, and militarism. Yes, we're going to talk about military-industrial complex. We're going to talk about 53 cents for every dollar that goes directly to military-industrial complex before we even get a dialogue on education and health care and a whole host of other things. Where is the public conversation about that kind of militarism? Or at war right now with 5 countries and hardly talk about it. Over 25,000 bombs dropped every year, hardly even talk about it. My dear brother Barack Obama, loved the brother, he's brilliant, poised, and a whole host of other things. Got a Peace Prize, but dropped 26,171 bombs the last year he was in office. How many died? How many were innocent? No talk at all. You can't have a democracy without parrhesia, without frank speech, honest speech. You can't hide it, you can't conceal it. How do you gain access to such a conversation with corporate media in place? Fundamentally concerned about rates and revenues. Not fundamentally committed to a robust conversation about the resources that are available and not available. You see. To talk about American democracy is to render all of us at our best Socratic, followers of parrhesia, enactors of paideia. They said, well, Brother West, Socrates ended up drinking a hemlock. I don't want to die. It's a good question. It's a very good question. There are forms of death that are operative while you're alive. A whole host of forms of death at work as you live. And if you're serious about the American democratic project, its conditions of possibility, how it emerged, what we get into, ways in which breakthroughs, retreats, flatten out, neo-fascist possibilities in the 30s. Sinclair Lewis talked about in his novel, it can't happen here. And then 2016, it might happen here. But then from the vantage point of enslaved Jim Crow folk, it's been catastrophic for the most part anyway. What's new? Oh, on the vanilla side of town, it looks like now they have a catastrophic consciousness because it affects them. What do you think American terrorism and Jim and Jane Crow was for 90 years? What do you think 90 years of U.S. slavery under the U.S. Constitution was all about? Catastrophe shot through. And same would be true for those Mexican brothers and sisters who lived in Mexico, what is now California, and now Texas, where borders move, given the land grabs and power grabs called the Mexican War and so forth. How do we keep track of all of those realities and still hold on to some possibility of intellectually, morally, spiritually fighting in a prophetic way? That's part of the challenge that we'll be dealing with and part of the dialogue between Brother Roberto and myself in terms of the ways in which he embodies so much of the best of the American prophetic tradition and at the same time is someone to be Socratized, to contest, just as he will come back and contest me. Let me stop now and then we'll turn it over to Brother Roberto.
Change seats with you.
Yes, absolutely.
Shall we have some discussion about the nature of the course before going ahead?
It's up to you, my brother.
What do you think? Or shall I just speak and then we discuss?
What do you all like to do? Demo speak. Let him speak? Absolutely. Go right ahead, Demo. She spoke on behalf of the demos.
This is a course about the interpretation of the American experience. and its meaning, not only for the Americans, but for humanity. And it is also a course about the alternative futures of the American Republic. In this inquiry that we propose, our understanding of the past will be motivated by our imagination of the future. And the driving force in our arguments here is the attempt to discern these possible futures and to discuss what would be necessary to develop the future that would best keep the promise of American democracy in the interest of the whole world, as well as of the Americans. In these introductory remarks, I want to propose just one take, my take, on the agenda of this course. And to do so by moving in 4 steps. The first step is to describe what I want to call the American prophecy, the message of the American prophets. The second step is to describe examples of the obstacles to the realization of this prophetic message in practice. The third step is to suggest the character of the major traditions of progressive reform in American history, and to say in what respect they were inadequate to the achievement of the prophetic message. And the fourth step is then to outline in the most schematic terms the general character of a direction that would realize more fully the message, for the realization of which these traditions of progressive reform were inadequate. The American prophets. I have in mind people like Emerson, Whitman, Melville, and Lincoln. The American prophets had a message about the higher meaning of the American national experiment as the essential spirit of American democracy. The message is that the ordinary man and woman is not so ordinary after all, and that our most essential attribute, the attribute that makes us most human, is that there is more in us, in each of us individually, and in all of us collectively, the human race, than there is or ever can be in the social and cultural worlds that we build and inhabit. These worlds, are finite in relation to us, and we are infinite in relation to them. A human being becomes more human by becoming more godlike. Not more godlike in the sense of omnipotence and omniscience, but in the sense of the divine attribute of transcendence. Transcendence is this surfeit, this excess. We spill over these contexts. And we, in the end, must not allow ourselves to be determined by the present circumstances of our existence. The essential faith of democracy, of American democracy, and of democracy in general, is faith in the constructive genius of ordinary men and women. And what makes this idea an idea of the sublime is that by becoming more human, by accepting the ordinary and ordinary men and women, we become more divine. So there is here a radical inversion, a transvaluation of values, in which the commonplace is affirmed to be higher than the noble or the exceptional. This was the prophetic message. And the fundamental question raised in the ordeal of the American people is, how is this message to be made manifest in practical life and in the arrangements of a state that finds itself in a world of other armed states needing to protect against them its national experiment? Now, it is very common to present the message of the American prophets uncritically, on the supposition that the only problem was the failure to honor this message in practice. But that's not the perspective from which I will engage the American prophecy. The American prophecy was tainted, even in its original formulation. It suffered from at least two spiritual perversions. And if it is to be achieved in practice, it must be achieved in a way that results in the correction of the message and not simply in its realization. The first taint on the prophetic message is a disturbed and inadequate conception of the relation between self-construction and solidarity, our connection to the others. It's as if the individual first builds himself, he makes himself bigger, and by being bigger, he is then stronger, and by being stronger, more magnanimous. And from this position of strength, he then enters into association with the others, voluntary association. The voluntary association emphasized, for example, by Tocqueville as one of the central aspects of the American experience in his work. But it's not like that, because our connections to the others are internal to the process of self-construction. One of the fundamental aspects of freedom is this: we cannot be free if we are not connected to the others, but every connection threatens us with subjugation and depersonalization. And the question is therefore, how can we be connected in such a way that we diminish this price or this risk? And then to the extent that we succeed, we are free and we come into the possession of life. Unless we understand that solidarity is internal to self-construction, the idea of self-construction will end up as the picture of a little Napoleon who crowns himself, and who then, on the basis of his generosity from his circumstance of dominion, can then connect with the others. Now, the second taint on the American prophetic message is the taint of institutional idolatry. So let me state it in a simple and a stark form at the risk of caricature or exaggeration. A fundamental belief of the Americans in their public religion, their ideas about their democracy, is that the United States discovered at its inception at the moment of its foundation, the definitive formula of a free society. This formula needs only to be adjusted from time to time under the provocation of crisis. The rest of humanity must either subscribe to this formula or continue to vegetate in poverty and despotism. Now, this idolatry of the institutions, exemplified by the naturalization of a particular version of the market economy, and in an even more radical form by the cult of the American Constitution, is a vast incubus on the American democracy. An incubus which the venerated founders themselves did not share. So Thomas Jefferson, for example, believed that the American Constitution should be thrown out and replaced every 2 or 3 generations so that the dead would not rule over the living. And James Madison, conservative, in 1829, in notes for the Virginia Convention, predicts that in 100 years, the majority of Americans would, quote, be necessarily reduced by competition for employment to wages which would afford them only the basic necessities of life. And then he goes on. The institutions and laws of the country must be adapted, and it will require for this task all the wisdom of the wisest patriots. Nothing to justify the subsequent institutional idolatry. So this is the prophetic message with its double taint. The prophetic message which represents one particular variant of a revolutionary project that for the last 200 or 300 years has set the whole world on fire. This project has 2 sides. It has a political side, represented by the doctrines of democracy, of liberalism, and of socialism. And it has a personalist side, represented by Romanticism, and especially by the worldwide popular romantic culture. This project has for a long time and remains today the most powerful project in the world. It has enemies, but it continues to command the agenda. And all the other projects in the world respond to it. But it is in a paradoxical situation. It is at the same time strong and weak. It is strong because it continues to command the agenda. But it is weak because its votaries no longer know what its next steps should be. What comes next on the political side or on the personalist side? Confusion. And from confusion, weakness. And that then is part of the background to this inquiry. The inquiry about American democracy and its next steps is an inquiry about the world. Now I go on to the second move in my remarks, simply to evoke a problem and an opportunity that reveal the obstacles to the achievement of a corrected version of the prophetic message. The first obstacle is very simple. The United States, like all the contemporary societies, is a class society. A class society in which the life chances of individuals remain powerfully shaped by the hereditary transmission of differential economic and educational advantage through the family. The official American doctrine is that the United States is a class society. In a little text that Cornell and I wrote many years ago, we cite the following passage from the speech with which Herbert Hoover accepted the nomination for re-election, to run for re-election as President of the United States, his adversary being Franklin Roosevelt. And he says the following in this speech: "It is by the maintenance of equality of opportunity, and therefore of a society absolutely fluid in freedom of the movement of its human particles, that our individualism departs from the individualism of Europe. We resent class distinction because there can be no rise for the individual through the frozen strata of classes, and no stratification of class can take place in a mass livened by the free rise of its particles." Now, it's remarkable. He said that in Madison Square Garden at the exact time when outside that building there were thousands of people lined up hungry without jobs to get food because the American economy had already collapsed. So there is a class structure in the United States, and it exists with particular strength and virulence. The United States is among the rich industrial countries of the North Atlantic world, one of the ones, or the one, with the least social mobility. There is a fairly straightforward class structure. On the top, there is a professional and business class. Its upper fringe is a moneyed plutocracy. Then there is a small business class. Then there is a working class with a white and blue-collar segment. And then there is a racially stigmatized underclass. That's the class structure of the United States. And there have been, in American history, only 2 episodes of massive social mobility. Through one episode, the children of farmers and farm hands became industrial workers. And through the other episode, the children of industrial workers became white-collar workers. Now, it is not possible to reconcile the reproduction of this class structure in the particularly rigid form that it has taken in the United States with the prophetic message, with the message of the American prophets. And it has turned out that the meritocratic principle, rather than undermining the class structure, has been assimilated by it as an adornment or an improvement that does not change its fundamental reality. Now let me give you the example of a second issue, which is now not so much a problem as it is an opportunity, a missed opportunity. There is now, in all the major economies of the world, a change in the character of the most advanced practice of production. There is a new most advanced practice of production, which we call the knowledge economy or the experimental economy. Dense in knowledge, radically experimental, and devoted to permanent innovation. It's not just high-tech industry. It exists in every part of the economy, in intellectually dense services, or even in precision and scientific agriculture. But wherever it exists as a fringe that excludes the vast majority of businesses and of workers. there is a radical hierarchical segmentation of the economy between advanced and backward sectors. This circumstance of this insular vanguardism, confined, quarantined, denied to the majority, then becomes a basis for both economic stagnation and economic inequality. How could there not be a slowdown in the growth of productivity if the most productive practice is denied to the vast majority of enterprises and of workers? And the hierarchical segmentation of the economy then produces a deepening of inequality, which compensatory redistribution by progressive taxation or redistributive social entitlements is completely inadequate to master. But the progressives in this circumstance, for the most part, have no project for the reorganization of the economy. No project, for example, to radicalize and disseminate the knowledge economy. No vision of the economy on its supply side, only on its demand side. That's the situation. And this situation then helps explain, in the contemporary circumstance, the reproduction of the class system and gives the lie to the message of the American prophets. Now comes the third step in my introductory remarks. Consider, in the most elementary form, the two major traditions of progressive reform in American history. One is the tradition of defending the little against the big, small business against big business, the little guy against the plutocracy, the magnates, from Jefferson to Brandeis. And the other is the tradition of accepting the control of the commanding heights of the economy by big business, but then subordinating it to regulation by strong national government. Those are the two main traditions of progressive reform in American history. Neither of them, nor both of them together, have been enough to change these fundamental realities. Not enough to destabilize the class system, and not enough to seize the opportunity presented by the emergence of the knowledge economy in its insular form in order to turn it into a knowledge economy for the many. And we could make a very long list of these unsolved problems and missed opportunities. What those two traditions of progressive reform have in common is that they both evade the imperative of structural vision and of structural alternatives. That's what they don't do. For example, they take the organization of the market economy for granted. So the premise in the public discourse is that there are basically two kinds of things you can do with the market economy. You can regulate it, and you can attenuate the inequalities that it generates after the fact by progressive taxation and by social entitlements. But there's a third thing you can do with the market economy that is much more important. The third thing is you can change its content. You can reshape the institutional arrangements defined in law that organize the decentralization of economic initiative and opportunity. That's what you can do. Now, it's not something fantastical, something distant. It doesn't happen through some big systemic transformation. Let me give you two examples from American history in the first half of the 19th century. Just to suggest what I mean by structural change. There was the huge burden of African slavery on one side, but then among the free white population, there was radical innovation in the two sectors that were then most important for the American economy, agriculture and finance. When Tocqueville visited the United States in the 1830s, only one free white man in 5 worked for another white man. This is an extraordinary fact about the United States in its formative period. And without appreciating that fact, you can't understand the formative ideas in the American Republic. It was a society of independent working people in which the great majority worked for themselves, not for others. That was the situation. In agriculture, in the early 19th century, the leftists and the liberals around the world all agreed that agrarian concentration was inevitable. It was an intrinsic feature of what Marx came to call capitalism, as had happened in England, in Britain. Agrarian laborers and peasants are driven out of the countryside, and there's the formation of large land holdings. But the Americans rejected that path. They distributed the land under the Homestead Acts, and they organized what in a contemporary vocabulary we would call decentralized strategic coordination between the government and the family farmers. For example, agricultural insurance, food stockpiles, to ensure family-scale agriculture against the combination of physical risk and economic risk. And among the family farmers, cooperative competition. They competed against one another, but also cooperated to achieve economies of scale. They then built the most efficient system of family-scale agriculture that had existed in the world up to that point. In finance, there was a conflict over the National Bank, which was the great instrument of the nascent financial plutocracy in the United States. And it culminated in the presidency of Andrew Jackson, in the dissolution of the National Bank, and in the prohibition of interstate banking for more than 100 years. The Americans then organized the most decentralized system of credit at the disposal of the local producer that had ever existed. When they did these things in agriculture and in finance, they were not regulating the market. And they were not compensating after the fact for economic inequalities by some kind of retrospective redistribution. They were reshaping the market. They were inventing, in those particular sectors, a different kind of market. That's what I mean by structural change. And that is then the real form of the democratization of a market economy. That's what these two dominant traditions of progressive reform failed to provide. What then, going on to the fourth stage of these remarks, would count as an example of an alternative that would realize the prophetic message and in the process of realizing, correct it. It would have to have at least three main axes institutionally. But it would also have to do more than create institutions. It would have to change consciousness. Tocqueville said that every powerful revolution is at the same time a political revolution and a religious revolution. By political, he meant institutional. And by religious, he meant a transformation in consciousness. The transformation in consciousness is the correction of the message of the American prophets. Its rescue from the double taint of institutional idolatry and of the disturbed understanding of the relation between self-construction and solidarity. And the institutional content would then have to move along three main trajectories. Now, a transformative project is not a blueprint. It's not like architecture. It's a succession of steps. It's like music. And the two most important attributes of a programmatic proposal are first, that it mark a direction, and second, that in the particular historical circumstance, it select the initial steps by which to begin to move in the direction. So it's necessary to provide a down payment on the proposed future to show, here's the anticipated example. Here's the way to begin moving in that direction. And one can imagine at least three main domains in which it would be necessary to begin this transformative effort. The first domain is the economy. And I gave an example. In every historical circumstance, there is a most advanced practice of production. What is the most advanced practice of production? It is always the practice that is closest to the imagination, that is most mindful. And that because it is most mindful, most fully reveals our powers. And today, this most advanced practice of production is what I labeled the knowledge economy. The knowledge economy exists today only in insular form. It's not being disseminated. The opposite is happening. The firms, many of them mega firms that control the knowledge economy, discover a way to transform part of their production into routines and commodities and then subcontract them out to businesses and workers in remote parts of the world, and retain for themselves only the creative and lucrative sanctum. That's what's happening. A kind of hyper-insularity rather than the dissemination of the knowledge economy. So it would have to be disseminated. And it's not disseminated spontaneously. It depends on a host of very special conditions, educational conditions, the creation of a particular moral culture. The knowledge economy requires a heightening of the level of discretion and of initiative, and therefore reciprocal trust among its participants, and accumulation of social capital and institutional changes that would begin radically to decentralize access to credit, to technology, to advanced practice, and that would end in the creation of alternative regimes of contract and property that would begin to coexist experimentally within the same market order. Why should the market economy be fastened to a single version of itself? We have to be able to innovate in its forms so that more people can have more access to more markets in more ways. The radicalization and dissemination of the market economy would have to be accompanied by other economic initiatives. For example, in the relation of finance to the real economy, under the present arrangements, to a very large extent, finance serves itself under the pretext of serving the productive agenda of society. The production system is largely self-financed on the basis of the retained and reinvested earnings of private firms. What then is the point of all of that money in the banks and the stock markets if it's not mobilized, in fact, for the productive agenda of society? We have to innovate in the arrangements that tighten the link of finance to the real economy. Then there's the relation of labor to capital. So now, increasingly, labor is being organized around the world in the form of decentralized networks of contractual arrangements. It's like the putting out system described by Marx in the early chapters of Capital on a global scale. It's not the old thing of mass production, of assembling a stable labor force in large productive units, factories under the aegis of unified corporations. And the result is that in increasing form, part of the labor force is in conditions of precarious employment, justified under the euphemistic label of flexibility. How can we create a new body of law to master this new economic reality so that the flexibility required by the knowledge economy not degenerate into a universal economic insecurity that depresses the returns to labor and inhibits the ascent up the scale of aggregation of value? Now, this is a vast project, but it's a project that cannot be replaced by the sugarcoating, by the papering over, by the acceptance of the market economy in its present form, combined with the attempt to, after the fact, correct it, mitigate. Progressive taxation never has more than a marginal effect on inequality. What the system of taxation and public spending does is to permit investment in people and in their capabilities. But it does not master the problem of inequality. The only way to master the problem of inequality is to change the structure, beginning with the economic structure, the structure of production, the relation between the advanced and backward sectors of the economy. Now then, the second major domain of indispensable innovation we have to do with the organization of politics. All the democracies that exist in the world are what you could call low-energy democracies. They depend on crisis to make change possible. For example, Franklin Roosevelt, the last great reformer in the United States, in American history, had as his allies the greatest war in world history and an economic collapse of unprecedented dimension. Even then he had trouble. And he had trouble because the system, the constitutional arrangements of the United States, a kind of proto-democratic liberalism, had been arranged to give people like him trouble. So in the American constitutional arrangements, there are two principles. There is a liberal principle of the fragmentation of power, and there is a conservative principle of the slowing down of politics. The Americans believe that these two principles are naturally and necessarily connected, but they are mistaken. They are not necessarily and naturally connected. They are connected by design and by intention to produce this slowing down of politics. And what would be necessary would be to reaffirm the liberal principle of the fragmentation of power, but to repudiate the conservative principle of the slowing down of politics. to heighten the level of popular engagement in public life, to accelerate the pace of politics through the rapid resolution of impasse, and to exploit the potential of the federal regime to be a machine for experiments, allowing parts of the country to create counter-models of the national future. So, innovations that heighten the temperature of politics, for example, through the public financing of political activity, or the free access to the means of mass communication for the political parties and the social movements. Innovations that accelerate the pace of politics, allowing either of the political branches, for example, to call early elections when faced with an impasse, but the elections always being bilateral for both branches. And innovations in the character of the federal system to allow parts of the country to secede from the general solutions under certain constraints and to create counter-models of the future. And there would be a natural sequence. It seems that in the United States, the easiest place to begin is the reinvention of federalism, because the Americans, with their pragmatic temper, are sympathetic to the experimentalist impulse and associate it with a federal regime. Then the next place would be the heightening of the temperature of politics, the relation between money and politics, or media and politics, and only in the last instance, far into the future, to touch the sacrosanct constitutional arrangements about the setup of the government, benefited by the institutional idolatry. Now then there would be a third great domain, which is the formation of the powerful agent, able not only to move within the context, but to resist it. So in this country with its that is large, unequal, and federal in structure, practical initiatives that reconcile the local management of the schools by the states and the municipalities with national standards of investment and quality. And a different style of education. What should this style of education be that is able to form the agent, the transformative agent? It should first give priority to the capabilities of the mind of analysis and of synthesis over information. It should second prefer selective deepening to encyclopedic superficiality. It should be cooperative in its social setting, as advanced science is. And above all, and this is the hardest part, it should be dialectical. No subject should be taught only once. Every subject should be taught at least twice from two contrasting points of view, the only way to liberate the mind. The orthodoxies of the university culture are organized on the basis of a forced marriage of methods to subject matter, to make it seem natural that each subject matter is studied by a certain method. And the national curriculums infantilize these orthodoxies of the university culture and induce the young to confuse, to mistake the dominant ideas for the ways things are. So then the young are emasculated and they're sent on to the higher levels of education, defenseless against a life of intellectual servility. And what do we then want? We want a form of basic education that is more profound than the form that is now provided in the universities, and that immunizes them against the orthodoxies that they will confront later. Now, these initiatives together are an example. They're an example of what the dominant reform traditions fail to provide. And how can this come to life? So, first, there has to be the construction of a concrete project, a programmatic proposal, the reverse side of which is an alliance of interests, of productive interests, of working interests of the majority across the racial and cultural divisions in the country. Second, there has to be a set of ideas. Ideas by themselves don't change the world, but without ideas, you can't change the world. And the ideas that are now dominant in the high academic culture of the social sciences and the public discourse all evade the imperative of structural vision. They are all anti-structural. Their dominant character is a naturalization or rationalization of the established arrangements. They are what in the history of philosophy we would call right-wing Hegelianism. They make the real appear to be rational. And insight into the actual is always dependent on imagination of the adjacent possible. And then there has to be a language. And this language, this practice, has to be both prophetic and realistic. It has to provide examples of the initial steps, but it has to represent both an expression and a correction of the American prophecy. The American prophetic voice needs to break its silence. In this task, which, as I argued at the outset, is important to humanity, not just to the Americans, the most important resource is the resource that the United States has in spades: vitality. Vitality is the supreme good. The supreme good is to come into the possession of life. And the highest goal, to die only once, rather than dying in installments. But vitality needs an ally. The ally of vitality is the imagination. And it is the cause of the imagination that brings us together here.
Oh, powerful, powerful, powerful. Now let me tell you what, you're right. Let me tell you think you're wrong. No, indeed. Because it's, you see, I don't think vitality is a crucial feature. I think that courage is. I think vitality is ideologically promiscuous. That it lies with a lot of different political and ideological orientations.
So is courage.
Courage is too. That's why the moral and spiritual foundation that transforms courage into a fortitude in which the democratic ideal that you began with in your profound and eloquent articulation here is so important. But then the question is still Plato's challenge, Dostoevsky's challenge, the Blues challenge. What makes you think that there's enough courage? Do you think there's an overwhelming amount of moral courage in the American empire right now to come to terms with xenophobic and authoritarian elites who rule? You see it every once in a while, but you don't see it in any massive way. Do you think that courage and fortitude and its deep and democratic orientation is a distinctive feature of Harvard students? No, there's a lot of brilliance, intelligence, vitality, but professional managerial movement into the status quo. That's the dominant orientation. I mean, I'm not putting it down. Let's just be honest about it. But, well, I am putting it down. But I understand. But so that the question becomes, you see, you and I come from countries that are ruled at the moment by xenophobic or authoritarian presidents. There's a tyranny of the majority. You all are going to be reading about and rereading about in de Tocqueville's text, right? Tyranny of the majority. Right? For black people, tyranny of white folk over. For women, tyranny of a minority, but still over them. For gay brothers, lesbian sisters, trans, tyranny of the majority will crush them like cockroaches. How do we somehow connect that conception of education and the vitality, but most importantly, to get beyond the comfort and convenience and allow yourself to take a risk and be willing to pay a cost? That is a spiritual, existential issue.
So let's see.
And that's what's lacking for the most part these days, because most people don't want to die.
So let's see.
Because repressive apparatus will kill you. Not just in America, in every country. They will repress you. They will send you to jail. They'll talk about you and your mama. Character assassination, literal assassination. No, that's real. So people say, well, I want to be progressive, but not that courageous. I want to be progressive, but I'm only going to well-adjust. I'm going to be well-adjusted in justice, just a little bit for my career. You talk about vitalization in this deeply democratic sense, and I could say quite openly, this brother, he has lived it, but everybody not like him. For every law professor like him, he got a whole host of colleagues who, let's just say, are different. I ain't gonna say nothing else. They're just different. I mean, am I lying or am I flying?
Cornel, let's see if we agree with some features of moral psychology.
So that we can get
I
overlap.
think that we agree more than you may.
Well,
have
we probably
suggested.
do. I'm just being provocative and Socratic here.
So,
Yeah.
So for courage.
Yes.
Courage is not the highest virtue.
I agree.
But it's the enabling.
But it's
virtue.
that's exactly
It's the
right.
enabling virtue, because without courage, all
right.
other virtues are rendered sterile.
That's right. Sounding brass and tinkers.
And courage.
Oh, then we're going to get to that. We're going to get to love. Yeah.
Courage and rendered sterile, and it's necessary to have it as a thinker as much as an agent.
That's right.
Courage is the indispensable virtue. However, courage is connected with hope, because the ability to be courageous is related to being hopeful. And now, hope is animated by ideas, in part by imagination, because a common sentiment in our situation is there are no alternatives. The world lives under a dictatorship of no alternatives. That idea undermines hope, and in undermining hope makes access to courage more difficult. Now, hope, here's another feature. Hope is ordinarily seen as a cause of action. But in a deeper sense, hope is a consequence of action. The way you become hopeful is by acting, and acting imaginatively as well as practically. The posture of the contemplative person is naturally fatalistic and ironic. Anyone who sees from afar. If you engage, if you begin to engage, you discover and generate transformative opportunity through engagement. And then you become hopeful. And engagement with ideas, engagement with action, and in being hopeful, you are more likely to be courageous. So these things are all connected. And it's natural that in this situation, we should privilege the idea part of this, which is the part that most lends itself to the setting in which we find ourselves here.
No, what I think it's very important to keep in mind that hope itself is not an unambiguous virtue. You go back to the Million Dialogues of Thucydides in the Peloponnesian War. It said hope is danger's comfort. There's blind hope that'll get you in trouble. There's blind hope that it won't allow you to see certain things you need to see in order to be effective in your courageous action. That's why hope is in Pandora's box. It's in Pandora's box because Prometheus gives human beings hope, but it's a blind hope. The question is, through paideia, through deep education, how does it become a mature hope? It's no accident that The Nice Man Cometh, again by Eugene O'Neill, is Harry Hope's saloon. Hickey is a seller of hope. He's a seller of the American dream. Arthur Miller will say a similar thing in Death of a Salesman and as artists. And art's going to play a very important role in this class because you can't talk about the imperial meltdown. You can't talk about the spiritual blackout or whiteout. You can't talk about the decay and decline in the American empire without allowing the artists to become more and more central because they tend to be much more courageous than political leaders or professional elites and so forth. Not that they have a truth, but they're involved in parrhesia. The speech is franker and plainer. You see, there's probably more wrestling with hope in Kendrick Lamar than there is most Harvard professors. That's real. Because Kendrick's talking about something life and death. He's not talking about promotion and the next Tea Party. He's talking about something where he's got to sacrifice. He's making big money. He got a Pulitzer. He really don't care at that point. He's wrestling with Compton. He's remembering the folk he loves. And he knows he's not going to be around that long, given the tradition from which he comes, going all the way back to Ma Rainey and Bessie Smith and the spirituals and so forth. So this issue of hope is a very complicated one, as you know. You know, my beloved Alexa's writing a whole project on this, though. Hope is a very dangerous thing. The audacity of hope. Love you, Barack. I do. I love the brother. But you don't play with something like that. The hope of a people who've been terrorized for 400 years. And Jeremiah Wright, who preached a sermon, but then don't want to have too much to do with his conception of hope. It gets deodorized. It gets colonized by the American mainstream. And it just dangles folk. We got a symbolic indictment of white supremacy. Magnificent. I'm for it all the time with the Harvard Law. Yes, sir. But what you going to do with the substantive side of that hope, that underside of that hope? Not just the symbolic side in which you can actually speak to the underside of your moment. What you going to do about Jim Crow, the new Jim Crow? What you going to do about the poverty? What you going to do about the drones? What you going to do about surveillance? What you going to do about national security policy? What are you going to do about foreign policies in Yemen, in Somalia, in Pakistan, in Afghanistan? That's where the serious connection of hope and courage comes. If you just dangle this hope up here, then you move right to the mainstream, you've deodorized it. You've snuffed out all the funk of it. And the worst thing you could do for oppressed people is take their funk away and make them live deodorized lives on the surface. Little superficial folk walking and moving like, look at me, like little peacocks. All foliage, not a lot of fruit. That's the challenge of those who are looking at American democracy, any democracy, from the underside. And I'll say this philosophically as a Christian, that when I hear Brother Unger say he wants us to be more God-like, I say to myself, you better get your cross together. If you want to be God-like, it's cruciform. You want to be more God-like, you better get ready to carry your cross. You know, oh, I don't want to carry a cross, but I want to be God-like. Oh, I see, Now you're just playing with it, you're playing with it. So in that sense, yes, God-like, I mean, I guess it's my own Christian prejudices, and we Christians have no monopoly on truth, goodness, or beauty. But we got something to say. Oh, yes, we got some insights. We got some lies to point to, because Brother Martin King ain't no joke. My mother wasn't no joke either. Ain't no joke. So this challenge that we're wrestling with in terms of how it connects to love, not love in the abstract, but our Jewish brothers and sisters' love of stranger. Leviticus, love of neighbor. Socrates, love of wisdom, love of beauty, love of goodness. You see, that kind of love is always sacrificial in some significant way without being self-righteous. And that's part of the problem. And I think part of the blindness that we have these days, especially in this moment where the empire is in such a deep problem, we got too much liberal self-righteousness to think that somehow all the bad stuff is on the right-wing reactionary side. And there's a whole lot over there, don't get me wrong. But all of it's over here. And if we could just get back to our mainstream liberal project, things would be business as usual. Business as usual is itself catastrophic. It's just better than what we have at the moment. You see, you have to be honest about that, be candid about that. So maybe we're not. Would you agree about the cruciform character of God like to?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. How come you don't really talk about that too much, though?
I
You, in terms of the cross?
Not in that vocabulary.
Not in that vocabulary. No, maybe we should open it.
The larger issue there,
Yes.
taking out its theological context.
Yes,
is
yes.
the role of sacrifice.
Absolutely.
And it is true that life is nothing if not sacrificial. And all transformative effort is sacrificial in character.
That's true.
But the nature of sacrifice is transformed
Absolutely.
by hope, and transformed by what's most important, and this is the reference to vitality,
Yes.
which is the possession of life.
Yes.
All any of us ever have in the end is life right now, in the present moment. And see that one of the problems in the American consciousness, which Tocqueville already deals with in some way, is the Americans are always searching for something beyond the future. Futurity is one of the characteristics of
Absolutely.
the American consciousness.
Absolutely.
And the danger in futurity is if the good that we seek is not what we have now, but something that will come later. And even something will come later in individual existence or in the collective history. And then we're always estranged from the present, from now, which is all we have. So the question is how this idea of living for the future can be turned into a way of living in the present, right now, as a being who's now not determined by the present conditions of his existence. And this, although it may seem a remote speculative comment, has something to do with our problem here in the course. Because we will be speaking throughout about the future and about alternative futures. And there is the danger that this discourse about the future itself becomes a kind of estrangement from the reality. So we have to see how this orientation to the future is represented now in our immediate experience, in the change in our ability to come fully into the possession of life right now in the present moment. And that is that's an aspect of this difficulty which is very hard to think about and talk about, but it's fundamental.
Yeah. I think you and I do have a difference, though, in terms of the balance between a revolutionary piety that I tend to begin with, as opposed to an orientation toward futurity that you highlight. That for me, the past and the best of the past is not just a precondition of how we proceed, but I can't conceive of my life without the afterlife of my father and my grandparents and Frederick Douglass and others somehow trying to break through me. You see, the black nationalist brothers and sisters call it Sankofa, where you refuse to move to the future without connecting with the best of the past. One of the distinctive features of a market-driven culture is to erase so much of the past. See, part of the attack on young people in their music and so forth is to erase any connection of them with an enabling past so that the present is simply a repetition of the instant gratification and the consumptive cycle of a capitalist productive project. So it's all about the present. It's all about the next pleasure. It's all about the next moment. It's all about the next success. It's all about the next glitz-driven celebrity move and so forth. And so piety is not uncritical deference to the past. It is the acknowledgement of the sources of good in your life from womb to tomb, so you can't conceive of who you are without the love of parents, without the support of uncle, without the teachers, without other folk who have shaped your insecure ego from mama's womb as you moved on to Harvard and hope for maturity and breakthrough and skill acquisition and so forth. So that history and piety in its subversive sense is crucial for me. That's what it is to be a blues man in the life of the mind. Because you can't deal with the catastrophe of the present without being enabled and ennobled by those who came before in how they wrestled with their catastrophe, even though you never imitate them in that regard. And in all honesty, I believe the greatest of us, in terms of the species, are dead anyway. I don't see no Curtis Mayfields around. I don't see no Arethas around. I don't see no Shakespeare's. I don't see no Beethoven's. I don't see no Maria Rukeyser's. Now, we got some magnificent folk alive. I don't want to downplay that. But if the greatest are gone, then if we lose contact with them, then even our conception of excellence becomes so tainted by the present criteria, which are so market-driven and so narrow and empty and vacuous in so many ways. You see. So that I know you acknowledge the crucial role of the past, but you've got much more of a Emersonian tilt, and I've got much more of a Melvillian, Toni Morrison-like tilt. And it's a fascinating overlap, but it's something that will surface over and over and over again in our class, in the dialogues,
Because
absolutely.
I hold the view, which may seem paradoxical to you, Cornell, or to you, the class, that the roots of a human being lie in the future and not in the past.
Right.
And
No,
the
I think
prophecy is higher than memory.
yeah, see, I think
And this- and
I
so
think you're wrong about
we
that,
do-
though. Oh, you're wrong about that.
We do differ. We do differ. We do differ.
But you're right about a lot of other things.
But
Yes.
there's then a problem that arises within this view
Yes.
of the roots lying in the future. That there's the collective future and the individual future.
That's true.
So these projects that we're speaking about, like the future of American democracy, are projects that advance or fail to advance in historical time, not on the dimension of a human lifetime.
That's right.
And we don't live in historical time. We live in biographical time. And so we have to have an ethic, a way of being, a way of acting that is for us now and that makes up for the failures of politics. We can't just be the instrument of a collective project. And I think that adds another element to the conversations that I hope we'll have here during the semester, which is the dominant focus is the collective project in historical time, the national project of the Americans and its significance for the world, its correction, its alternative futures. But there's the question, what about us right now? And given that we don't command the relative advance or failure of this project, what is the ethic, what is the way of being and of acting and of feeling which is appropriate to the individual living in the circumstance of this failed political project, of this project that hasn't advanced. And I think that's a subject in which
that's
we fully share
crucial.
concern.
That's crucial. And see, I think the concern is twofold, though. One is, and we're going to open this up, though, but one is, see, my conception of being human has much to do with gratitude of those who came before. And I can't see how you have a gratitude to futurity if you're not yet there. But you can have deep gratitude for what is part of your experience in the shaping and molding of who you are, who loved you, who cared for you, who sacrificed for you, and so forth, you see. So that's deeply existential and experiential. But the second is Chekhov's challenge. And this is a fundamental challenge. What if you are told that your collective project has a chance of a snowball in hell? Do you give up on it even though it's right, even though it's full of integrity? Now, see, my position is that you pursue the collective project if it's right, if you're convinced it's just, it's shot through with integrity, it's shot through with moral and spiritual excellence, even if it has the chance of a snowball in hell. So futurity itself can't be the fundamental source of your roots, or if there's a failure built into the context in which you're trying to achieve the realization of your project, you might give up on it. And that's real. And that's very much what so many of the folk who shaped me had to deal with. 244 years of slavery, that's a lot of generations. But you keep loving folk anyway. But you don't lie to them and say, well, this generation, we're going to break the back of American slavery. No. You're going to be dead by 27. The average age of a slave in the United States. But you pass that love on anyway. You pass that dignity on anyway, because you're committed to it regardless of what the future looks like. You got this little child in front of you right now. You love it to death. And the same is true under Jim Crow. Same is true in the hood right now. You see, no matter what happens with the police, no matter what happens with those teachers, we're going to love you anyway. But it doesn't look like America as a whole is committed to your dignity and your humanity. But somebody's going to love you even though you don't have a chance, for the most part, of breaking through. There might be a few. And when they break through, they become the avatar of American success on TV. Blah, 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 blah. And tell the masses of folk to live vicariously through them, through their success, as if their lives don't have the same status as the person who's successful. That's a different kind of orientation, you see. And we're going to see the ways in which my more tragic comic sensibility leads toward the same kind of radical democratic politics. And Brother Unger's tragic sense, but with that very future orientation, leads toward a very similar kind of radical democratic projects too. But of course, I will be accenting empire as well. I'll be accenting the ways in which American democracy has actually been able to flourish in part because of its imperial powers, and what happens when those imperial powers begin to decline and wane. Does that bring out the neo-fascist possibilities in what was a democratic project? Because that empire is beginning to decline in discernible, empirically investigatable ways, you see. And we got China and other kinds of challenges with their own ugly realities, as well as some of the positive elements. But maybe we should open it up. Yes, you got a question?
How can we as individuals engage in Paideia, have courage, maintain vitality when objective truth and the search for truth is really mocked by those in power right now?
No, I mean, you never determine your behavior based on what people in power are doing. Never, ever, ever. And don't be surprised when people in power mock truth. Most rulers mock truth. That goes all the way back thousands of years. There's different forms of mock. I mean, presently we've seen some thick versions of mock, but there's been a lot of thin versions around for a long time. But you never determine the kind of human being you want to be in terms of being critical, courageous, and compassionate and sacrificial based on anything other than the stories that you choose to follow, the examples you choose to build on, the exemplars that you decide are worthy of your living, of your laughing, of your loving, of your working, of your serving. Does that make sense? That's interesting. A little louder, my dear brother, so we can all hear you. Yeah.
Well, that's what all intellectual innovation does. So just so we understand the reference, I was saying a principle of the organization of the orthodoxies of the university culture is the naturalization of a marriage between a certain method and a certain subject matter. So economics is not the study of the economy. It's the study of a method developed by the economic theoreticians at the end of the 19th century, the marginalists. Evolutionary biology is studied by a historical method, but fundamental physics is studied by an anti-historical method. But why? In the 1920s, we discovered that the universe has a history. Cosmology is not an afterthought. It's not just scaled up astronomy. Every part of natural reality could be studied historically. So the cards can be jumbled up. And every fundamental intellectual innovation robs this semblance of naturalness from the marriage of method and subject matter. Now, that relates to what we're doing here, because there's no natural method for what we propose to do here. What's the method? We have to experiment with methods as we go along. And that's both a disadvantage and an advantage. Divorce the method from the subject matter. Recombine methods and subject matters. That's not the view with which we would normally approach the study of a country. So we'd say, we're going to study the United States. Now we're going to apply to the study of the United States the ideas of economics, and political science, and sociology. But what we are saying in effect is we need economics to understand the United States, but not the economics that exists, another one that doesn't exist, or another political science, and so forth. That's why the study of a natural experiment has such potential intellectual fecundity. It has the potential to be intellectually subversive. It reveals the inadequacy of the present disciplines and of the methods to which they're married.
Oh, here and then here.
I would imagine that for the majority of us in this room, either in our past or currently, were quote unquote educated in a system where we are kind of vessels and we are to receive and have knowledge deposited into us. One of the things that was mentioned up here was about this kind of notion of criticality and how we really need to manipulate and work with the knowledge that is available in this world. And so how would you suggest that we do that when the pedagogy that we've been brought up and the way that we think about knowledge and information is the way that we think about it?
No, I think that there's a whole host of highly creative folk, including yourself. I don't want you to underestimate yourself. Highly creative folk who could get beyond just the dissemination of information and want to be tying education to transformation. I think the whole host of folk here who undergone, is that true? Would you all say that's true in your own pedagogical experiences and so forth? Even when you're spoon-fed, you critically filter it, examine what the assumptions and presuppositions are, put forward your argument. You may have to maybe tone it down for the paper to get an A+, go home and say, no, I didn't lay it out the way I wanted to, but it's nice to get a good grade so I can get into Harvard Law, and so forth and so on. But no, the critical consciousness is already there, latent in some form. It's just a matter of trying to allow it to become more manifest and recognizing that no one of us will ever possess the whole truth, capital T. So it's dialogical, it's polyphonic, it's improvisational across the board.
There's a specific problem that comes from...
Is that you or me, brother?
That's mine.
Oh, okay.
There's a specific problem that comes from the history of our ideas about society. And just to abbreviate a statement of this problem, the problem is the following. The classical European social theory, especially the variant of it that has exercised the greatest influence on the left, on the progressives throughout the world, which is Marxism, had a view of structure and structural alternatives. But it was a view corrupted by a series of fatalistic illusions about society and history. So in Marx, for example, there's the idea that there's a closed list of regimes: feudalism, capitalism, socialism. Each of them is an indivisible system. And they're driven forward by inescapable laws of historical transformation. We don't need to have a project because history has a project for us. The consequence of this idea of the indivisible systems is a binary view of politics. There are two kinds of politics. There's the revolutionary substitution of one system for another, and there's the reformist management of a system. If you're not doing the revolutionary substitution, you're doing reformism. So then you think in the following way, well, revolution is impossible, the systemic change. It's not available. If it were available, it would be too dangerous. What's left to do is to humanize the existing world. So then come the progressives, the contemporary progressives, who appear on the stage of history as the humanizers of the inevitable. And so you see how the idea of revolution, which is a fantasy of the systemic change, is converted into its opposite and becomes a pretext for this humanizing management. Real structural change is almost always fragmentary, but can nevertheless be radical in its outcome if it continues. But we don't have a theory of it. So then you come to the contemporary social sciences, and each of them, in its own way, evades the imperative of structural vision. They don't teach us how to think about change. And what they do is they normalize the existing arrangements. They make them seem natural. The result is to sever the vital link between insight into the actual and imagination of the adjacent possible. As in any branch of study, of science, of knowledge, to understand a phenomenon is to understand what it can become under certain provocations. If you don't understand what it can become, you don't understand it. You're not understanding it, you're just staring at it, or you're redescribing it. And that is, on the whole, with some exaggeration, the circumstance in contemporary social science. We then here have a problem. We're engaged in an inquiry with structural ambitions into the past and the future of the United States. We need a set of structural ideas, a practice of structural insight. Apparently, it doesn't exist. And so this provides an extraordinary complication, a methodological complication, an intellectual complication in our exercise. And is a difficulty which lends extraordinary interest and charm to what we're trying to do.
So one last question out there, sister. I saw her hand up right here. Yeah.
If American democracy currently relies on profits, then isn't it counterproductive to like the realization of democracy?
Yeah, so
Creating that hierarchy and value.
It's a very interesting remark. I'll say something, and I'm sure Cornell will speak to this. It's true that there is in all transformative practice, in the actions of individuals, a relation between visionary teaching and exemplary action. And then we associate that with individuals. But you're absolutely right that the Democrat must believe that prophetic powers must be diffused within the whole of humanity. As the Protestant Reformation taught the priesthood of all believers, the Democrat must insist on these prophetic powers of the whole of humanity. And for example, this is the role of the school under a democracy. The school must recognize in every child a tongue-tied prophet and provide the child with the instruments with which not only to operate within the existing context, but to resist it. The prophet has to see himself as no more than the example or the advanced line of this collective power, which has to be diffused widely in the whole of the people.
No, I mean, your question is a very, very deep one, because again, I think that when you look at the history of our species, that we tend to be at our best when we take seriously grand examples of love and justice and allow their stories to inform who we become over time. Now, Ralph Waldo Emerson was expelled from Harvard for 33 years for answering your question when he gave the divinity address. When the faculty at Harvard Divinity School invited him to talk about prophecy, and he said, Jesus, mere Jesus, there's a Jesus in all of us. They said, oh, we got the wrong brother, we got the wrong brother. Oh, Lord, he got different theology than we do. He's democratizing the notion of prophetic energy. That last line of experience, my whole aim, Emerson says, is to transform genius into practical power and form. And by genius, he meant this prophetic energy. But what is that prophetic energy? Well, it's always in a story. It's in a narrative. It's Jesus, it's Esther, it's Muhammad. It could be Martin King. It could be a whole host. It could be a fictional figure, right? In the Charterhouse of Parma and so forth and so on. But these examples inform us. But it's very important because, see, in academic discourses, we're much more obsessed with rules than we are examples, you see. And therefore, see, the difference between knowing how and knowing that. You can never appeal to a rule to teach you how to apply a rule. But when you hang around examples, you start picking up the courageous acts. You start picking up the ways in which they look at the world. You start picking up the lens through which they view the world. That's very practical, but it can't be put in abstract formulation. Certainly can't be put in algorithms or in any kind of a theorem. Is it time up? Yes. Can't be put within ordinary time. You know, we're talking about prophetic energy that just flows. See you all next week. See you next week. Don't let this cold get you down. Don't let this cold weather get you down. Keep your hearts warm. And we appreciate these two magnificent fellows we got here. Good God. We had a session, brother. We had a session, man. We